In the ancient mountains of Jabal Qasiyun, 7 young believers disappeared for 4 centuries, protected by Allah's miraculous hand as they slept through the rise and fall of empires. Awakening to find their forbidden faith had become the foundation of a new Islamic civilization. In the blessed land of Sham, during the reign of the tyrannical Emperor Qadmus I and Malik, peace be upon you. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are listening from around the world, so we can share this journey through the Qur'an together. There lived 7 young men whose hearts Allah had illuminated with the light of Tawheed. Their names were Yusuf ibn Ahmad, a skilled carpenter whose hands crafted beauty from wood; Khalil ibn Rashid, a merchant whose honesty in trade was renowned throughout the markets; Salim ibn Nasr, a scholar who memorized the ancient scriptures; Omar ibn Hakim, a physician who healed both body and soul; Marwan ibn Qasim, a blacksmith whose strength was matched only by his gentleness; Hamza ibn Tariq, a shepherd who knew every path through the mountains; and the youngest among them, Said ibn Abbas, barely 17, whose pure heart reflected the sincerity of untested faith. These 7 souls had been guided to the truth by a mysterious traveling teacher, a righteous man known only as Sheikh Nur al-Din, who appeared in their city of Dimash al-Qadima, like a gentle breeze carrying the fragrance of paradise. He spoke of one Allah, creator of the heavens and the earth, who deserves all worship and obedience. His words fell upon their hearts like rain upon fertile soil, and each young man felt his soul awaken from the slumber of ignorance. The city of Dimash al-Qadima was magnificent to behold, with its towering palaces of white stone, its bustling markets filled with merchants from distant lands, and its grand temples dedicated to the false gods of their ancestors. The Emperor Qadmus ruled with absolute authority, demanding not only political submission, but religious conformity. Every citizen was required to offer daily sacrifices to the golden statue of the sun god, Rod, to burn incense before the silver idol of the moon goddess Qamar, and to prostrate before the bronze figure of the war deity, Sef al-Qad. The empire's religious ceremonies were elaborate affairs. Every morning, as the sun rose over the eastern mountains, thousands of citizens would gather in the great plaza of worship, chanting ancient hymns while priests in jeweled robes performed mystical rituals. The air would fill with the smoke of burning offerings, the sound of beaten drums, and the cries of sacrificial animals. Those who failed to participate faced immediate imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet these 7 young men, their hearts now illuminated with the light of Islamic faith, could no longer participate in these acts of shirk. Yusuf found that his hands trembled when he was commanded to carve idols from wood. Khalil discovered he could no longer swear by false gods when making business contracts. Salim's studies of ancient texts revealed the corruption that had crept into the original messages of previous prophets. Omar refused to invoke the names of false deities when treating his patients. Marwan could not bring himself to forge weapons and ornaments for the pagan temples. Hamza began offering his prayers facing the direction of the sacred house in Makkah, while alone with his flocks. And young Zayd openly questioned the logic of worshipping created things instead of their creator. Sheikh Nur al-Din had taught them the fundamental principles of Islamic faith. La ilaha illallah, he would say, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. There is no God worthy of worship except Allah. This is the foundation upon which the heavens and the earth rest. Everything else, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth itself, these are all created beings, servants of the one true Lord. How can a servant be worshipped alongside its master? How can the created be elevated to the level of the Creator? He taught them about the day of judgment, when every soul would stand alone before Allah to account for their deeds. The grave, he would say, is either a garden from the gardens of paradise, or a pit from the pits of hell. The choice is made in this life, through the beliefs we hold and the actions we perform. The Sheikh also spoke of the previous prophets, Ibrahim, the friend of Allah, who destroyed the idols of his people, Musa, who led the children of Israel away from Pharaoh's tyranny, and Isa, who called his people to worship Allah alone. All the prophets, he explained, brought the same essential message: worship Allah alone and prepare for the life to come. But people have corrupted these teachings, mixing truth with falsehood, guidance with misguidance. As the days passed, it became increasingly difficult for the 7 companions to hide their transformation. Their families noticed their reluctance to participate in religious festivals. Their neighbors observed their absence from temple gatherings. Their employers questioned their refusal to invoke the traditional gods in their work. The first to face serious consequences was Khalil, whose business partner reported him to the religious authorities for refusing to swear by the sun god during a major trade negotiation. Khalil was summoned before the high priest Magus al-Akbar, a tall, imposing man, whose eyes burned with fanatical zeal. You dare insult the mighty rod, source of all light and life? The priest demanded, his voice echoing through the marble halls of the temple. Khalil stood firm, his heart strengthened by his faith. I worship only Allah, the one who created the sun, the moon, and all that exists between the heavens and the earth. I will not associate partners with him, for that would be the greatest injustice. The priest's face darkened with rage. Blasphemy! You will recant these words immediately, or face the consequences. But Khalil's response was calm and dignified. I have tasted the sweetness of faith in Allah. How can I return to the bitterness of worshipping His creation? Word of Khalil's defiance spread quickly through the city. Soon the other 6 companions found themselves under increasing scrutiny. Government officials visited their homes, questioning their families. Temple guards followed them through the streets. Informants were placed among their colleagues and friends. The situation reached a crisis point when Emperor Cadmus himself issued a decree. All citizens must publicly reaffirm their loyalty to the state religion by participating in a grand festival of sacrifice. Any who refused would be considered enemies of the empire, subject to immediate execution. The 7 friends met secretly in Yusuf's workshop as the sun set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the city they had known as home. The scent of wood shavings filled the air as they sat in a circle, their faces grave with the weight of the decision before them. My brothers, Yusuf began, his voice steady. Despite the enormity of their situation, tomorrow we must choose between our faith and our lives. There can be no compromise, no middle path. Either we bow before the false gods and save our bodies while destroying our souls, or we remain firm upon Tawheed and trust in Allah's protection. The youngest, Said, spoke with wisdom beyond his years. Did not Shaykh Nur al-Din teach us that this life is but a brief test, that Allah tests those He loves with trials that reveal the truth of their faith? Perhaps this is our test, our opportunity to prove that we truly believe in what we claim. As they prepared to face an uncertain future, each man felt the same conviction burning in his heart. They would rather die as believers than live as hypocrites. They would trust in Allah's wisdom and mercy, whatever the consequences might be. The night before the great festival dawned clear and cold, with stars scattered across the heavens like diamonds on black silk. The 7 companions had agreed to meet at the cave of Hara al-Nur, a secluded grotto high in the mountains of Jabal Qasiyun, where Shaykh Nur al-Din had first taught them the principles of Tawheed. Each man made his way through the darkened streets of Damashq al-Qadima, avoiding the torch-bearing patrols that roamed the city in preparation for tomorrow's ceremonies. Yusuf was the first to arrive, carrying a simple bag containing bread, dates, and a water skin. He had left his carpentry tools behind, knowing he would never return to his workshop. As he climbed the rocky path, he reflected on the strange peace that had settled over his heart. Despite the magnitude of what they were about to face, he felt no fear, only a deep certainty that Allah would provide. One by one the others joined him. Khalil brought gold coins from his trading business, thinking they might need provisions during their exile. Salim carried the few precious scrolls he had managed to save, containing verses from the revealed scriptures. Omar packed medicines and healing herbs, his physician's instinct compelling him to prepare for any eventuality. Marwan brought his strongest knife and flint for making fire. Hamza, familiar with mountain survival, carried rope and warm cloaks. Young Zayd brought nothing but his unwavering faith and a heart full of trust in Allah's mercy. When they were all assembled in the cave, Khalil spoke first. My brothers, I have received word that the Emperor has ordered his guards to search every house in the city tomorrow. Any man who fails to appear at the festival will be hunted down and executed along with his entire family. Omar nodded gravely. I treated one of the palace guards today for a fever. He told me that they have prepared crosses for crucifixion and pits filled with burning oil. The Emperor intends to make examples of any who defy his religious decree. Salim opened one of his scrolls and read by the light of their small fire. In the ancient writings, it is recorded that the Prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was thrown into the fire by Nimrod for refusing to worship idols, but Allah made the fire cool and safe for him. The Prophet Musa, peace be upon him, faced Pharaoh's armies at the sea, but Allah parted the waters and provided escape. The Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, was pursued by those who rejected his message, but Allah raised him up and protected him from their plots. Hamza, who had spent countless nights under the stars while tending his flocks, looked up at the cave ceiling and said, in all my years shepherding, I have learned that Allah provides shelter for every creature. The birds find refuge in the trees, the deer in the thickets, the sheep in the fold. Surely He will provide refuge for those who seek protection in His name. Marwan, his strong hands clasped together, spoke with quiet determination. I have forged weapons for the emperor's army, thinking I was serving my people. But now I understand that the only fight worth fighting is the struggle against shirk and falsehood. If Allah wills that we die for refusing to bow to false gods, then we die as believers. If He wills that we live, then we live as His servants. Young Zayd, his eyes bright with the fervor of youth, stood and faced his companions. Sheikh Nur al-Din taught us that paradise is surrounded by difficulties, while hell is surrounded by desires. Tomorrow, they will offer us the desires of this world, safety, comfort, acceptance, if we will only bow to their false gods. But we have tasted something sweeter than all these things. We have tasted the peace that comes from knowing our Creator. As the night deepened, they performed their prayers together, taking turns leading the Salah as Sheikh Nur al-Din had taught them. They recited the verses they had memorized, reminding themselves of Allah's promises to those who remain steadfast in faith. The cave seemed to glow with a gentle light, though their fire had burned low. Yusuf spoke the words that were in all their hearts. My brothers, let us make a covenant with Allah this night. Let us promise that whatever befalls us, we will not utter a single word of shirk, we will not bow to any false god, and we will not compromise our tawheed for any consideration in this world. One by one, they placed their hands together in the center of their circle and repeated the covenant. As they did so, each man felt a profound transformation occurring within his soul. The fear that had lingered in the corners of their hearts vanished completely, replaced by an absolute trust in Allah's wisdom and mercy. Khalil raised his hands in dua and prayed, Our Lord, we have believed in you and placed our trust in you. We seek refuge in you from the trials of this world and the next. Grant us mercy from your presence and guide us rightly in our affair. Protect us from those who would force us to commit shirk. And if you have decreed that we should leave this world, then take our souls as believers, never having associated partners with you. As dawn approached, they could hear the distant sounds of the city awakening, the call of merchants preparing their stalls, the clatter of cart wheels on stone streets, the first movements of what would soon become a day of grand pagan celebration. But in their cave, surrounded by the peace that comes only from complete submission to Allah, the 7 companions prepared to face whatever trial awaited them. They knew that within hours, they would be declared enemies of the state. They understood that their families would disown them, their friends would abandon them, and their former lives would be erased forever. Yet none of this troubled them, for they had discovered something more precious than all the treasures of the world, the unshakable certainty that they worshiped the one true God. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky with hues of gold and crimson, the sounds of the great festival began to echo across Damashq al-Qadimah. Thousands of citizens streamed toward the grand plaza of worship, their voices raised in hymns to the false gods. The 7 companions could hear the distant thunder of drums, the clash of cymbals, and the ceremonial horns announcing the beginning of the day's rituals. But they remained in their cave, performing the morning prayer as Sheikh Nur al-Din had taught them, facing toward the sacred house in Makkah. Their voices joined together in the recitation of the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Qur'an, though they knew it only in fragments from their teacher's instruction. The peace that had settled upon them during the night remained unbroken. even as they heard the sounds of their former life calling to them from the valley below. By the time the sun had fully risen, messengers were already racing through the streets of the city. The emperor's guards had discovered that 7 prominent young men were missing from the festival. House-to-house searches had begun immediately, with soldiers breaking down doors and interrogating family members. The penalty for harboring fugitives from the religious decree was death, and soon the entire city was gripped with fear. Captain Malik ibn Ghalib, commander of the emperor's personal guard, was a ruthless man whose loyalty to the throne was matched only by his cruelty toward those who opposed it. He had been charged with finding the 7 missing men and bringing them back alive to face public execution as an example to any other potential dissidents. The captain's first stop was Yusuf's carpentry workshop, where he found the young man's tools laid out neatly, as if their owner had simply stepped away for a moment. But the neighbors reported that no one had seen Yusuf since the previous evening. At Khalil's trading post, the captain discovered that the merchant had given away much of his remaining inventory to the poor the day before, keeping only a small bag of gold coins whose whereabouts were now unknown. They knew, Captain Malik muttered to his lieutenant. They planned this escape, question everyone who had contact with them, find out where they might have gone. The interrogations were swift and brutal. Yusuf's elderly father was beaten until he revealed that his son had been meeting regularly with 6 other young men. Khalil's business partner, threatened with the loss of his own trading license, admitted that the merchant had spoken frequently of caves in the mountains where he sometimes went to think and pray. Salim's teacher at the scribal school, faced with the destruction of his library, reluctantly mentioned that his student had shown unusual interest in the old paths leading up Jabal Qasiyun. By midday, Captain Malik had assembled a force of 50 mounted soldiers and began the ascent into the mountains. The trails were numerous and treacherous, winding through rocky outcroppings and dense thickets of olive trees and wild herbs. But the captain was methodical in his search, dividing his men into smaller groups to cover every possible route. Meanwhile, in the cave of Hira al-Nur, the 7 companions had spent the morning in prayer and recitation. They could hear the distant sounds of the search parties, the neighing of horses, the shouts of soldiers, the clatter of weapons against rock. But instead of fear, they felt only a deepening sense of divine protection. Hamza, whose knowledge of the mountain paths was extensive from his years as a shepherd, reported that he could see torchlight from multiple search parties converging on their general area. "They will find this cave before evening," he said quietly. "There are too many of them, and they know these mountains better than I thought." Omar checked their supplies and calculated that they had enough food and water for perhaps 3 days if they rationed carefully. "But what then?" he asked. "We cannot hide here forever, and we cannot descend back into the valley without facing capture." Salim opened his scrolls and read again the stories of the prophets who had faced similar trials. In every case, he observed, when the believers exhausted all human means of escape, Allah provided a solution that was beyond human imagination. Perhaps we must exhaust our own efforts before His miraculous intervention becomes manifest. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of the search parties grew closer. They could hear Captain Malik's voice echoing off the rock faces as he directed his men to search every crevice and hiding place. The tramping of boots and the scraping of armor against stone indicated that the soldiers were now exploring caves within a few hundred yards of their location. Young Zaid, who had been sitting quietly in contemplation, suddenly spoke. "My brothers, I feel a strange drowsiness coming over me. It is not the natural tiredness of a sleepless night, but something else. Something peaceful and irresistible." The others looked at him with concern, but then Omar noticed that he too was beginning to feel an overwhelming urge to sleep. "This is unusual," he said, his medical training making him alert to such symptoms. "We should be filled with nervous energy, given our circumstances, yet I feel as if my eyelids are being weighted with lead." Marwan nodded slowly, his strong frame beginning to relax, despite his efforts to remain alert. "I have worked many long days at the forge without such fatigue. This sleep that calls to us, could it be a mercy from Allah?" Khalil, fighting to keep his eyes open, managed to say. Sheikh Nur al-Din spoke of how Allah provides for his servants in ways they cannot anticipate. Perhaps this is his protection for us. One by one, the 7 companions felt the divine sleep descending upon them like a gentle blanket. Their last conscious thoughts were prayers of gratitude to Allah for his mercy, and complete trust in his wisdom. As their eyes closed and their breathing became deep and peaceful, the sounds of the approaching soldiers seemed to fade into distant echoes. The cave of Hira al-Nur fell silent, except for the soft rhythm of 7 sleeping believers, while outside, the greatest manhunt in the history of the empire continued its relentless search. Captain Malik ibn Ghalib reached the entrance to the cave of Hira al-Nur, just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. His face was flushed with exertion and anger, his armor clanking as he dismounted from his sweating horse. Behind him, 24 of his most trusted soldiers formed a semicircle around the cave mouth, their swords drawn and ready. "This is it," the captain declared, studying the narrow opening that led into the mountain's heart. "The old shepherd we questioned said this cave was known to be frequented by young men seeking solitude. If they're not here, they've vanished like smoke." Lieutenant Hakim ibn Saad, a younger officer eager to prove his worth, stepped forward. "Shall I lead a party inside, Captain? If they're trapped in there, we can smoke them out, or starve them into submission." But as the lieutenant approached the cave entrance, something extraordinary occurred. A family of mountain doves, disturbed from their roost, suddenly flew out of the cave in a great fluttering of wings. The birds circled once around the soldiers' heads, before settling on a nearby olive tree, cooing peacefully, as if they had been nesting undisturbed for many days. Captain Malik frowned at this unexpected sight. Doves were notoriously sensitive creatures, easily frightened by human presence. If men had been hiding in the cave, the birds would never have made their roost there. Still, his duty demanded thoroughness. "Bring torches," he ordered. "We'll search every corner of this accursed hole." As the soldiers prepared their torches, an even more remarkable sight greeted them. Across the narrow entrance to the cave, stretching from one side to the other, hung an intricate spider's web that sparkled with morning dew. The web was perfect in its construction, clearly the work of many days, with not a single strand broken or disturbed. Lieutenant Hakim stared at the web in confusion. "Captain, if anyone had entered this cave recently, they would have destroyed this web. No man could pass through such an opening without breaking these threads." The captain examined the web more closely, his military mind analyzing what he saw. The spider sat placidly in the center of its creation, a large brown creature that showed no signs of alarm at their presence. Around the web's edges, small insects were caught in the sticky strands, evidence that the web had been functional and undisturbed for several days at least. "Moreover," added Sergeant Kasim, an older soldier with decades of tracking experience, "look at the ground before the cave entrance. There are no fresh footprints in the dust, no broken vegetation, no signs that anyone has passed this way recently." Captain Malik's frustration was evident as he studied the scene. Every instinct told him that this was exactly the kind of place where fugitives would seek refuge. The cave was remote, defensible, and offered both shelter and a view of the approaching valleys. Yet the evidence before his eyes suggested that no human had disturbed this place for many days. "Break down that web," he commanded finally. "I want this cave searched thoroughly, regardless of what we see." But as Lieutenant Hakim raised his sword to slash through the spider's web, a strange reluctance came over him. The web was so perfectly formed, so delicate in its beauty, that destroying it seemed almost sacrilegious. His hand trembled, and the sword point wavered. "Sir," he said hesitantly, Perhaps we should consider that our fugitives have taken a different route entirely. This web could not have been constructed if people had been entering and leaving this cave, and the doves, they would never nest where humans had recently been present." Captain Malik stared at the web for a long moment, his logical mind warring with his duty to the Emperor. Finally, with a curse of frustration, he lowered his own sword. "You're right, no one has been here. We're wasting time while the real fugitives escape to distant lands." Unknown to the soldiers, inside the cave, the 7 companions lay in their divine sleep. Their breathing was so soft as to be nearly inaudible, their bodies positioned naturally, as if they had simply chosen to rest in this peaceful place. A supernatural tranquility filled the cave, and around them, other signs of Allah's protection were manifest. The temperature within the cave remained perfectly comfortable, neither too warm nor too cold. Despite the changing weather outside, a gentle breeze seemed to circulate through the space, keeping the air fresh and sweet. Most remarkably, the 7 sleepers appeared to be slowly turning from one side to the other in their sleep, though they were completely unconscious. This divine movement prevented their bodies from developing sores or stiffness that would normally result from prolonged immobility. Their faithful dog, a loyal companion that had followed young Zayd to the cave, lay stretched across the entrance with its paws extended. The animal had also fallen under the same divine protection, sleeping peacefully while serving as an additional guardian for its sleeping masters. As Captain Malik and his soldiers departed, frustrated and empty-handed, the spider continued its patient work, repairing any minor damage to its web. The doves returned to their roost, settling back into their peaceful cooing, and deep within the mountain, 7 young believers continued their miraculous sleep, protected by the mercy of Allah from all the armies of the world. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the cave entrance with golden light that seemed to shimmer with divine blessing. In the valley below, the great festival continued, but here in this sacred space, time itself seemed to have been suspended by the will of the Almighty. The search parties would continue for many more days, covering every mountain path and valley hideaway within 50 miles of the city. But they would never again come so close to the cave of Hira al-Nur, for Allah had decreed that His faithful servants would remain hidden until the appointed time for their awakening. Years flowed like water through the valleys of Sham, and the world beyond the cave of Hira al-Nur transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable to those who had known the reign of Emperor Cadmus IV bin Malik. Seasons turned in their eternal cycle. Springs brought wild flowers to the mountain slopes. Summers blazed with golden heat. Autumns painted the olive groves in bronze and amber, and winters covered the peaks with pristine snow. Through all these changes, the seven companions slept on in perfect peace. In the first decade after their disappearance, Emperor Cadmus had continued his brutal persecution of any who refused to worship the state gods. The great temples of Ra'ad, Kamar, and Sef al-Kar grew ever more magnificent, their golden spires reaching toward the heavens like accusations against the one true God. Captain Malik ibn Ghalib had been promoted to General of the Imperial Guard, his failure to capture the seven fugitives forgotten in light of his success in crushing other religious dissidents. But time, the great leveler of all human pride, gradually eroded the foundations of the pagan empire. Emperor Cadmus died in his sleep. Some said from a fever, others whispered from divine punishment. His son, Cadmus IV bin Cadmus, proved to be weak and indecisive, more interested in palace intrigues than religious enforcement. The great festivals became less frequent, the mandatory worship ceremonies less strictly enforced. As decades passed, subtle changes began to appear throughout the empire. Merchants arriving from distant lands brought strange new ideas, tales of a prophet who had arisen in the Arabian Peninsula, preaching the worship of one God and the abandonment of idols. These stories were officially suppressed, but they spread like seeds on fertile ground among people whose hearts had grown weary of empty rituals and meaningless ceremonies. The turning point came during the reign of the third emperor after Cadmus, a man named Malik ibn Hakim al-Rashid. Unlike his predecessors, this ruler had been exposed to the teachings of Islam through his travels as a young prince. When he ascended the throne, he shocked the empire by declaring his conversion to the faith of the Arabian prophet. May peace and blessings be upon him. I have studied the scriptures of our ancestors, Emperor Malik announced to his astonished court, and I have found that they originally taught the worship of one God. The idols and false deities are corruptions introduced by those who sought to lead people away from truth. From this day forward, this empire shall worship Allah alone, as taught by his final messenger. The transformation was gradual, but inexorable. The great temples were converted into mosques. Their golden idols melted down to fund schools and hospitals. The priests of the old religion were given the choice to convert or retire, and many, recognizing the truth when they heard it, embraced Islam with sincere hearts. The call to prayer echoed from newly built minarets, replacing the ancient hymns to false gods. Yet even as these monumental changes swept across the land, The cave of Hira al-Nur remained a place apart from time. The spider continued to maintain its web across the entrance, generation after generation of the tiny creatures taking up the same protective duty. The doves nested and raised their young in the olive branches outside, their descendants carrying on the same watchful guardianship that had protected the sleepers since the first day. Travelers occasionally passed near the cave, for the mountain paths were still used by shepherds and merchants seeking shorter routes between cities. Some noticed the unusually perfect spider web that never seemed to be broken, or the family of doves that never migrated with the seasons. A few even approached close enough to peer into the cave's mouth, but they saw only shadows and heard only the whisper of wind through stone passages. One such traveler was an elderly Islamic scholar named Sheikh Abdullah ibn Yusuf, who had spent his life studying the history of the early believers in Sham. He had heard rumors and legends about 7 young men who had vanished during the persecution of the pagan emperors, and he often wondered what had become of them. As he rested near the cave during a journey between Damascus and Aleppo, he felt a strange peace descend upon him. "O Allah," he prayed, sitting in the shade of the olive tree, "if those young believers are still alive somewhere, protect them and guide them. If they have died as martyrs for your sake, grant them the highest paradise. And if their story serves some purpose in your divine plan, let it be revealed when the time is right." The scholar could not have known that he sat mere yards from the sleeping forms of the very men he remembered in his prayers. Within the cave, the 7 companions continued their miraculous rest, their faces serene and youthful despite the passage of decades. Their beards had grown long and white, but their bodies showed no signs of decay or aging. Their simple clothes, preserved by divine power, remained clean and intact. The faithful dog, now a legend passed down through generations of mountain animals, still maintained its vigil at the cave entrance. Local wildlife had come to recognize the cave as a sacred place, and no predator or scavenger dared to disturb the peace that emanated from within. As the Islamic Empire grew in strength and righteousness, and as the old pagan customs became nothing more than cautionary tales told to children, the time approached when Allah would awaken His faithful servants. The world they would open their eyes to would be as different from the one they had left as paradise is from the earth. But for now, they slept on, trusting in Allah's wisdom and timing, protected by His infinite mercy from all the changes and chances of the temporal world. 4 centuries had passed since the 7 companions first closed their eyes in the cave of Hira al-Nur. The Islamic Empire now stretched from the shores of the Atlantic to the borders of India, and the city once known as Damashq al-Qadima had been renamed Damashq al-Islamiyya, becoming one of the great centers of Islamic learning and culture. The magnificent mosques that had replaced the pagan temples echoed daily with the recitation of the Qur'an, and the streets that had once run with the blood of believers now bustled with scholars, merchants, and pilgrims, making their way to and from the holy cities. On a peaceful morning in the month of Ramadan, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern peaks of Jabal Qasiyun, something stirred within the depths of the sacred cave. It began as the slightest quickening of breath, an almost imperceptible change in the rhythm that had remained constant for 400 years. Yusuf ibn Ahmad was the first to open his eyes. The sensation was gradual, like emerging from the deepest and most restful sleep of his life. He blinked several times, expecting to see the familiar stone ceiling of the cave, but instead found himself looking at what appeared to be the same rocky surface, though somehow different. The air felt fresher, cleaner, and carried unfamiliar scents, the fragrance of jasmine and rose water that he did not remember from before. "Brothers," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the long silence, "are you awake?" One by one, the other 6 companions stirred and opened their eyes. Khalil sat up slowly, running his hands through his now white beard in bewilderment. Salim blinked at his scrolls, which lay beside him exactly as he had left them, though they appeared somehow brighter and more preserved than they should have been. Omar stretched his limbs, marveling that he felt no stiffness, despite what seemed like a very long sleep. Marwan examined his hands, noting that his calluses from the forge were still present, unchanged. Hamza looked toward the cave entrance, where unfamiliar sounds drifted in from the outside world. Young Zaid, though his beard was now long and gray, retained the bright eyes of youth. As he looked around at his companions in wonder, "How long have we slept?" Khalil asked, his merchant's mind immediately trying to calculate the implications of their absence from the city. "It feels like a full day," Omar replied, his physician's training making him assess their physical condition. "Yet I am not hungry, nor am I thirsty. This is most unusual." Salim consulted the position of the sun visible through the cave entrance. "The light suggests it is morning, but I cannot tell if this is the morning after we fell asleep, or something else." As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to venture outside, they noticed their faithful dog stirring as well. The animal rose and stretched, wagging its tail in recognition of its awakened masters, showing no signs of age or infirmity, despite what they would soon discover had been centuries of loyal guardianship. The first shock came when they reached the cave entrance. The spider web that had protected them was still there, but it seemed different, more elaborate, as if countless generations of spiders had maintained and rebuilt it over an extended period. The olive tree outside had grown massive, its trunk now requiring several men to embrace it fully, its branches thick and gnarled with great age. "This tree was young when we sought refuge here," Hamza observed, his shepherd's knowledge of plant growth making him the first to suspect the truth. "Look at its size now. This growth would require many, many years." But the greatest shock awaited them when they began their descent down the mountain path toward the city. The familiar landmarks were still there, the distinctive rock formations, the bend in the valley, the general layout of the terrain, but everything else had changed dramatically. Where they expected to see the golden spires of pagan temples, magnificent domed mosques rose into the sky, their minarets calling the faithful to prayer, with voices they had never heard before. The city walls had been rebuilt in a completely different style, with Islamic geometric patterns carved into the stone. Gardens and fountains adorned spaces that had once been parade grounds for military displays. As they approached the outskirts of the city, they encountered people whose dress and appearance were unlike anything from their time. The men wore turbans and long robes in the Islamic fashion, and the women were modestly covered according to the teachings of the Prophet. Children played in the streets, their games accompanied by the recitation of Quranic verses, rather than the pagan chants they remembered. "By Allah," whispered Zayd, his young eyes wide with amazement, "what has happened to our world?" An elderly merchant approached them, noting their confused and bewildered expressions. He was a kind-faced man named Abu Bakr ibn Malik, whose family had traded in this region for generations. "Peace be upon you, travelers." He greeted them with the Islamic salutation they had learned from Sheikh Nur al-Din, but had never heard spoken publicly. "You appear to be strangers to our city. May I offer you assistance?" "Peace be upon you as well," Yusuf replied carefully. "We are travelers who have been away for some time. Could you tell us, what year is this according to the Islamic calendar?" Abu Bakr looked at them with surprise. "Why, it is the year 451 after the Hijra of the Prophet. May peace and blessings be upon him. Have you been traveling in distant lands where the Islamic calendar is not used?" The 7 companions exchanged glances of amazement and dawning comprehension. If the merchant spoke truthfully, they had slept for over 4 centuries. The world they had known, the pagan empire of Emperor Cadmus, the persecution of believers, the worship of false gods, all of it had passed away like a dream. "Tell us," Khalil asked with growing excitement, "what has become of the old religion, the temples of Rad and Kamar?" Abu Bakr laughed gently. "Those are names from ancient history, brother. The last pagan temple was converted to a mosque more than 300 years ago. This entire region has been Muslim for generations. Surely you know this." The realization of Allah's incredible mercy began to dawn upon them. They had been preserved, not just from persecution, but through the entire transition from darkness to light, from shirk to tawheed, from oppression to the justice of Islamic rule. The news of the 7 mysterious strangers spread through Dimashq al-Islamiyah like ripples across still water. Abu Bakr ibn Malik, the merchant who had first encountered them, was a respected member of the community, whose word carried weight. When he reported their strange questions about centuries-old pagan temples, and their apparent ignorance of basic Islamic history, the local imam, Sheikh Hakim ibn Abdullah, requested to meet with these unusual travelers. The 7 companions found themselves in a situation they could never have imagined. The city they had known as a place of persecution had become the center of Islamic learning. The Grand Mosque of Dimashq al-Islamiyah, built on the very site where the Temple of Rad had once stood, was filled with scholars studying the Qur'an and Hadith. The call to prayer that echoed from its minarets was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Sheikh Hakim ibn Abdullah was a man of profound wisdom and gentle demeanor, whose white beard and kind eyes spoke of decades spent in the service of Allah. He received the 7 men in his study, a room lined with countless volumes of Islamic texts, including works by scholars whose names would have been unknown in their original time. "My brothers," the sheikh began, after the customary greetings and expressions of hospitality, "Abu Bakr has told me of your conversation. Your questions suggest you have been away from this region for a very long time indeed. Tell me, what are your names, and from where do you come?" Yusuf, as the eldest, spoke for the group. Our names are Yusuf ibn Ahmad, Khalil ibn Rashid, Salim ibn Nasser, Omar ibn Hakim, Marwan ibn Qasim, Hamza ibn Tariq, and Zayd ibn Abbas. We are from this very city. Though we knew it by a different name, we sought refuge in the mountain caves during the persecution under Emperor Qadmus ibn Malik. Sheikh Hakim's eyes widened with recognition and amazement. He rose from his seat and went to one of his bookshelves, retrieving an ancient manuscript bound in worn leather. "Subhanallah," he murmured. "If what you say is true, then you are the 7 young believers mentioned in the chronicles of our early Islamic historians." He opened the manuscript carefully and began to read. In the year when Islam first came to the land of Sham, there were found records of 7 righteous young men who had disappeared during the final persecution of the pagan empire. Their names were Yusuf ibn Ahmad, a carpenter; Khalil ibn Rashid, a merchant; Salim ibn Nasser, a scribe; Omar ibn Hakim, a physician; Marwan ibn Qasim, a blacksmith; Hamza ibn Tariq, a shepherd; and Zayd ibn Abbas, the youngest among them. They were said to have refused to worship the false gods and vanished without trace. The 7 companions listened in stunned silence as their own story was read back to them from a book written centuries after their disappearance. The Sheikh continued reading. The historian Ibn Asakir wrote that these 7 men were among the first believers in this region, guided to the truth by a mysterious teacher known only as Sheikh Nur al-Din. Some scholars believed they had been martyred in secret, while others suggested they had fled to distant lands. But a few wise men proposed that Allah had preserved them in some miraculous way, to be revealed at the appointed time. Khalil leaned forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "You speak of Islam coming to this land as if it happened long ago. How long have the people here been Muslim?" "My brother," Sheikh Hakim replied gently, "Islam was established in this region more than 3 centuries ago. The last pagan emperor converted to Islam in the year 89 after the Hijra. His great-grandson built the first mosque on the ruins of the pagan temples. This has been a Muslim land for longer than most people can remember." The profound implications of their situation began to dawn upon the 7 companions. They had been preserved not just from death, but through the entire transformation of their world. Allah had allowed them to sleep through centuries of gradual change, awakening them in a time when their faith was no longer a cause for persecution, but the foundation of an entire civilization. Omar spoke with wonder in his voice. "Then our prayers have been answered beyond our wildest dreams. We prayed for Allah's protection from those who would force us to commit shirk. We prayed that He would not let us die, except as believers, but He gave us far more than we asked for." Young Zayd, though now aged in appearance, retained his youthful enthusiasm. "We feared we would be forced to choose between our faith and our lives. Instead, Allah preserved both our faith and our lives, and granted us the joy of awakening in a world where His unity is proclaimed from every minaret." Sheikh Hakim closed the manuscript reverently. "This is indeed a sign from Allah, a proof of His power and mercy. You are living witnesses to the truth, that Allah never abandons those who trust in Him. Your story will strengthen the faith of believers until the end of time. As word of their identity spread throughout the city, crowds began to gather outside the mosque. Scholars came from distant cities to meet the 7 men who had slept through centuries, but rather than being treated as curiosities or objects of superstition, they were honored as righteous predecessors whose steadfastness had been rewarded by divine miracle. The companions found themselves in a position they had never expected. They had become teachers and inspirations to an entire generation of Muslims who had never known persecution for their faith. Their simple story of choosing Allah over worldly comfort resonated powerfully with believers who sometimes took their religious freedom for granted. In the days that followed, they would learn about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the revelation of the complete Qur'an, the spread of Islam across the known world, and the rich tradition of Islamic scholarship that had developed during their miraculous sleep. But for now, they simply marveled at the wisdom and mercy of Allah, who had turned their moment of desperate need into a demonstration of His eternal faithfulness to those who trust in Him. The days following their remarkable awakening became a period of intense learning and spiritual growth for the 7 companions. Sheikh Hakim ibn Abdullah, recognizing the unique nature of their situation, took personal responsibility for their Islamic education. Though they had possessed the fundamental belief in Tawheed and knowledge of some prophetic traditions through Sheikh Nur al-Din's teachings, they now needed to learn about the complete revelation that had transformed the world during their sleep. In the cool morning hours, before the heat of the day began, the 7 men would gather in the mosque's study circle as Sheikh Hakim opened the noble Qur'an before them. The first time they heard the complete Fatiha recited in its perfect Arabic, tears flowed down their weathered faces. They had known fragments of this prayer from their teacher, but to hear it in its complete revealed form was like drinking from a spring after 4 centuries of thirst. Listen carefully, Sheikh Hakim said as he began to recite Surah Al-Kahf. For Allah has honored you by making you living examples of the very story told in this chapter. As the Sheikh recited the verses about the people of the cave, the 7 companions recognized their own experience reflected in the divine revelation. The young believers who sought refuge, the divine protection during their sleep, the awakening to a changed world. Every detail of their story was echoed in the sacred text that had been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, centuries after their own time. Salim, who had been a scribe in the Old World, was particularly amazed by the linguistic perfection of the Qur'an. In all my studies of ancient texts, he marveled, I have never encountered such eloquence, such precision of meaning. Each word seems to carry layers of wisdom that reveal themselves gradually to the contemplating heart. Sheikh Hakim nodded approvingly. The Qur'an is the final revelation, perfecting and completing all previous scriptures. It contains guidance for every aspect of human life, from the most intimate personal matters to the governance of nations. Over the following weeks, they learned about the 5 daily prayers, and how the simple worship they had practiced in their cave had been refined and perfected in the Islamic tradition. Omar, with his medical background, was fascinated by the health benefits embedded in the Islamic prayer movements and the wisdom of the prescribed ablutions. Khalil, the former merchant, was deeply impressed by the comprehensive Islamic economic system. In our time, he told Sheikh Hakim, trade was often corrupted by dishonesty and exploitation, but these Islamic principles of commerce, the prohibition of interest, the emphasis on honesty, the rights of workers and consumers, they create a just society where wealth serves all people, not just the wealthy. They learned about the Hajj pilgrimage to Makkah, and how Muslims from every corner of the world gathered annually in the sacred precincts where Ibrahim and Ismail had first proclaimed the oneness of Allah. Hamza, whose shepherd's life had taught him about the movements of communities, was moved by the image of millions of believers united in worship, regardless of their race, nationality, or social status. Marwan discovered that Islamic civilization had produced remarkable advances in metallurgy and engineering. The tools and techniques he had known in his blacksmith's forge had been refined and expanded, leading to architectural marvels and technological innovations that served both practical and spiritual purposes. Young Zayd, despite his now aged appearance, approached these new teachings with the enthusiasm of his youth. He was particularly drawn to the stories of the Prophet's companions and how they had transformed from a persecuted minority to the leaders of a vast and just civilization. One afternoon, as they sat in the mosque courtyard, listening to the melodious recitation of a young Hafiz who had memorized the entire Qur'an, Yusuf spoke what was in all their hearts. We thought we were fleeing from persecution into uncertainty. Instead, Allah was guiding us into a future where our faith would be honored, and our example would strengthen the believers. Sheikh Hakim smiled at this insight. This is the wisdom of Allah, my brothers. What appears to be a trial is often a preparation for a blessing. What seems like an ending is often a new beginning. You were preserved not just for your own sake, but to serve as a sign for future generations. The companions also learned about the rich tradition of Islamic scholarship that had developed during their sleep. They met historians like Ibn Kathir's students, philosophers like Al-Ghazali's followers, and jurists who had spent their lives deriving practical guidance from the Quran and Sunnah. The depth and sophistication of Islamic learning amazed them, but they were equally impressed by its accessibility to common people. In our time, Salam observed, knowledge was hoarded by a privileged few, but here, I see children memorizing the Quran in the streets, merchants discussing points of Islamic law in the marketplace, and craftsmen applying Islamic principles in their work. This is truly a civilization built on divine guidance. As their education progressed, the 7 companions began to understand their role in this new world. They were not merely curiosities from the past, but living bridges between the early struggle for Islamic truth and its eventual triumph. Their story would be told in mosques and schools, reminding future generations that Allah never abandons those who remain steadfast in their faith. Their presence in the city attracted scholars and seekers from across the Islamic world, all eager to meet the men whom Allah had preserved as a sign of His power and mercy. Yet the companions remained humble, always directing attention away from themselves toward the lessons their experience taught about divine wisdom and the rewards of patient perseverance in faith. As word of the miraculous awakening spread throughout the Islamic world, The 7 companions found themselves facing a trial they had never anticipated during their years of persecution: the challenge of fame and public attention. Caravans arrived daily in Damashq al-Islamiyya, carrying scholars, students, and curious believers from as far away as Al-Andalus in the west and Baghdad in the east, all seeking to meet the men whom Allah had preserved for 4 centuries. The great courtyard of the mosque became a gathering place, where hundreds would assemble to hear the companions speak about their experiences. Local authorities had to establish special arrangements for crowd control, and the city's inns overflowed with visitors who had traveled for months just to witness this divine sign with their own eyes. Initially, the 7 men were overwhelmed by the attention. Yusuf, who had been a simple carpenter, found himself being asked profound theological questions by scholars whose learning far exceeded his own. Khalil discovered that merchants were seeking his blessing for their business ventures, believing that his touch might bring divine favor to their enterprises. Omar was consulted about medical ailments by physicians who thought his 4-century sleep might have granted him supernatural healing powers. The most difficult challenge came when wealthy nobles and government officials began competing to offer them luxurious accommodations, expensive gifts, and positions of honor in their courts. The governor of Damascus himself, Amir Muawiyah ibn Yazid, invited them to live in his palace as honored guests, promising them every comfort and privilege. One evening, as they sat together in the simple quarters Sheikh Hakim had provided for them within the mosque complex, the companions discussed this unexpected trial. "My brothers," Yusuf said thoughtfully, "we fled from the palace of Emperor Cadmus to avoid compromising our faith, only to find ourselves centuries later being invited into another palace. Perhaps this is Allah's way of testing whether we learned the lessons of our previous trial." Khalil nodded gravely. "I notice that when people speak to us, they often seem more interested in our miraculous sleep than in the faith that motivated our original flight. They see us as curiosities rather than as simple believers who chose Allah over worldly comfort." Salim had been observing the crowds carefully with his scholar's eye. "Many of those who come to see us seem to expect that we possess some special spiritual powers, as if our long sleep has made us different from other Muslims. But we know that our preservation was Allah's gift, not our achievement." Omar, ever practical in his medical approach, had noticed something troubling. "Some people are beginning to treat us almost like saints to be venerated rather than examples to be followed. I have seen visitors trying to collect threads from our clothing or water from vessels we have used, as if these things possessed magical properties." Young Zayd, whose youthful wisdom had only deepened with their experience, spoke what they all felt. "Sheikh Nur al-Din taught us that the greatest danger for a believer is not persecution from enemies, but corruption from friends. The tyrant attacks our bodies, but admirers can corrupt our souls through pride and self-importance." Marwan, whose strength had always been matched by humility, clenched his weathered hands. "I find myself beginning to enjoy the attention, to feel important when scholars seek my opinion. This troubles me greatly, for I know I am no wiser today than I was when we first sought refuge in the cave." Hamza, drawing on his experience as a shepherd, offered an insight. "In the mountains, I learned that the most dangerous paths are often those that appear easiest. When we fled persecution, the danger was obvious and we could guard against it. But this admiration comes disguised as honor, making it harder to recognize the spiritual peril it represents. The following morning, the companions made a decision that surprised everyone who had come to know them. They approached Sheikh Hakim with a request that demonstrated the depth of their spiritual understanding. "Honored Sheikh," Yusuf said, speaking for all seven, "we wish to decline all offers of special accommodation and luxury. We ask instead for permission to serve the mosque in simple capacities, as cleaners, as assistants to the scholars, as helpers in the kitchen that feeds the poor." Sheikh Hakim studied their faces carefully, recognizing the wisdom behind their request. "You wish to disappear back into ordinary life, despite the extraordinary nature of your preservation." "Exactly," Khalil replied. "Allah preserved us to be a sign of His power and mercy, not to become objects of worship ourselves. The best way we can honor His gift is to live as humble Muslim servants, allowing our story to point people toward Allah rather than toward us." The companions also requested that a formal statement be prepared and read in the mosque, clarifying their role and purpose. Salim, with his scribal skills, helped draft the declaration. "We are Yusuf, Khalil, Salim, Omar, Marwan, Hamza, and Zaid, 7 ordinary men whom Allah chose to preserve as a sign of His power and a proof of His faithfulness to those who trust in Him. We possess no special knowledge beyond what any sincere Muslim can attain through study and devotion. We have no magical powers, no supernatural abilities, no authority to intercede between Allah and His servants. We ask that you honor our story not by venerating us, but by learning from our example that Allah never abandons those who choose Him over worldly comfort, and that patient perseverance in faith will always be rewarded beyond our greatest expectations." This humble response to fame only increased people's respect for the 7 companions, but in a healthier way. Rather than seeing them as mysterious figures to be awed, the Muslim community began to appreciate them as models of how ordinary believers should respond to both trials and blessings. Their insistence on performing menial tasks around the mosque, despite offers of luxury, became a powerful teaching about the true nature of honor in Islam. Visitors who came expecting to meet mystical saints instead found simple men sweeping floors, serving meals to the poor, and studying the Qur'an alongside beginning students. As the initial excitement surrounding their awakening settled into a more measured appreciation, the 7 companions established a quiet but profound influence on the Islamic community of Dimashq al-Islamiyya. Their daily routines became lessons in themselves, demonstrating how extraordinary faith could be lived through ordinary actions. Each morning before the Fajr prayer, the companions would gather in the mosque courtyard for their own private study circle. Salim would read from the Qur'an, while the others listened, their faces reflecting the same wonder they had felt during their first encounters with the complete revelation. These early morning sessions were not formal teaching gatherings, but many young students began arriving early, just to observe their reverent approach to the sacred text. Yusuf had resumed his carpentry work, but now his skills served the mosque and the wider community. He crafted simple, elegant minbars for newly established mosques in surrounding villages, and taught young apprentices not just woodworking techniques, but the spiritual principles that should guide a Muslim craftsman. Every cut of the saw, every strike of the hammer, he would say, should be done with the consciousness that Allah sees our work. The beauty we create in wood is a reflection of the beauty Allah has placed in our hearts. Khalil had declined offers to establish a new trading business, instead volunteering his commercial expertise to help the mosque manage its charitable endowments. His centuries-old experience with honest trading practices proved invaluable in ensuring that the community's resources were managed with complete integrity. Young merchants would seek his advice, and he always emphasized that true profit came from Allah's blessing on honest transactions, not from clever manipulation of markets. Omar established a small clinic for the poor in a modest building adjacent to the mosque. His medical knowledge, though from an earlier era, was enhanced by his deep understanding of the connection between spiritual and physical health. He treated patients without charge, supporting himself through the community's donations, and always reminded those he treated that true healing came from Allah alone. Marwan set up a forge in the mosque's service area, where he repaired tools for the poor and created simple implements needed for the mosque's daily operations. His work attracted young blacksmiths, who were amazed by his skill, but even more impressed by his character. He would often say, "Iron becomes stronger when it passes through fire. The believer's heart becomes stronger when it passes through trials." Hamza used his knowledge of mountain paths to guide pilgrims traveling to and from the holy cities. He established a small hostel for travelers, providing safe lodging and reliable information about routes and conditions. His gentle manner and vast experience made him a beloved figure among the pilgrims, who carried stories of his kindness to distant lands. Young Zayd, despite his aged appearance, had retained his enthusiasm for learning. He became a dedicated student in the mosque's school, sitting alongside children a fraction of his apparent age, as he mastered Quranic recitation and Islamic jurisprudence. His humility in learning from teachers who were centuries younger than his actual age became a powerful example of how the pursuit of knowledge should never end. The companion's approach to teaching was always indirect and humble. Rather than delivering formal sermons about their extraordinary experience, they would share insights through casual conversations, gentle corrections, and personal examples. When asked about their 4-century sleep, they consistently directed attention away from the miraculous aspects toward the spiritual lessons. "The miracle was not that we slept for so long," Yusuf would often say, "but that Allah's mercy preserved us until we could see His promise fulfilled." Every believer who remains steadfast in faith experiences the same miracle, though perhaps not in the same dramatic form. Their presence had a stabilizing effect on the community. During a period when some Muslims had begun taking their religious freedom for granted, the companions' stories reminded everyone of the precious nature of the faith they had inherited. Young people who heard about the persecution the seven had faced developed a deeper appreciation for their ability to practice Islam openly. The companions also served as living links to the early days of Islam in their region. Historians and scholars would consult with them about social conditions, cultural practices, and historical details from the pre-Islamic and early Islamic periods. Their accounts provided valuable insights into how Islamic values had transformed society over the centuries. As years passed, The 7 men aged naturally, having been restored to normal temporal existence after their miraculous preservation. They faced this aging process with the same faith and acceptance they had shown throughout their trials. They continued their daily routines and community service, even as their physical strength gradually diminished. Sheikh Hakim often remarked that the companions' greatest teaching was not their dramatic story of divine preservation, but their demonstration of how extraordinary faith could be lived through completely ordinary lives. They had shown that true religious significance lay not in miraculous experiences, but in consistent devotion to Allah through daily service to His creation. Their influence extended far beyond Dimashq al-Islamiyya. Visitors carried their example to distant parts of the Islamic world, and their story became a beloved teaching tool for scholars explaining the concepts of divine mercy, patient perseverance, and humble service. The cave of Hira al-Nur became a place of pilgrimage, not for its miraculous properties, but as a reminder of Allah's faithfulness to those who trust in Him. The 7 companions had achieved something remarkable. They had become famous for their humility, honored for their service, and remembered not for their miraculous experience, but for the simple dignity with which they had lived both their trials and their blessings. As the companions entered their final years in the natural world, they began to sense that their earthly mission was drawing to a close. They had witnessed the transformation of their society from paganism to Islam, contributed to their community through humble service, and demonstrated the timeless principles of faith through their daily lives. Now, they felt called to leave a lasting message for future generations of believers who would face their own trials and challenges. The idea emerged during one of their morning study sessions when a young scholar named Ahmad ibn Muhammad approached them with a question that had been troubling the academic community. "Honored elders," he said respectfully, "there are some among the scholars who debate whether the trials you faced were harder or easier than those confronting Muslims today. Some argue that open persecution tests faith more severely, while others contend that the subtle challenges of prosperity and comfort pose greater spiritual dangers." Khalil smiled gently at the question. "My young brother," he replied, "this question itself reveals a misunderstanding of divine wisdom. Allah does not test all believers in the same manner, nor does He measure the difficulty of trials by external circumstances. The scholar facing doubts in his study may struggle more intensely than the martyr facing the sword." This conversation sparked a series of discussions among the companions about how they might articulate their understanding for future generations. They decided to collaborate on a written legacy, not an autobiography or historical account, but a collection of spiritual insights drawn from their unique experience of living through both persecution and prosperity. Salim, with his scribal skills, served as the primary recorder, but all 7 companions contributed to what they called Wasiya ila al-Mu'min al-Qadimin, testament to future believers. The document began with a fundamental principle: "Know, O believers who will come after us, that every generation faces the same essential choice we faced, to worship Allah alone, or to bow before the false gods of their time. The forms of these false gods change. Sometimes they appear as golden statues, sometimes as social acceptance, sometimes as material comfort, sometimes as political power. but the choice remains constant, and so does Allah's promise to those who choose correctly. The companions spent months refining their message, addressing different aspects of faith and life they had learned through their extraordinary journey. Yusuf contributed insights about maintaining spiritual focus while engaging in worldly work. His section emphasized that every honest profession could become an act of worship when performed with the right intention. The carpenter who builds with integrity, he wrote, serves Allah no less than the scholar who teaches with sincerity. The key is not the nature of the work, but the consciousness of the worker. Whether you shape wood or shape minds, remember that Allah sees every effort and judges every intention. Omar addressed the relationship between physical and spiritual health, drawing on his medical background and his understanding of Islamic holistic well-being. His contribution emphasized the importance of caring for the body as a trust from Allah, while never allowing physical concerns to overshadow spiritual priorities. The body is a temporary vessel for the eternal soul, he explained. Care for it as you would care for any valuable item entrusted to your keeping, but remember that its ultimate purpose is to serve in the worship and obedience of Allah. Health is a blessing to be grateful for. Illness is a test to be borne with patience, and both are opportunities for spiritual growth. Marwan wrote about the dignity of manual labor and the spiritual lessons embedded in working with one's hands. His blacksmith's wisdom offered profound insights into how physical craftsmanship could develop spiritual character. Iron teaches patience. It cannot be rushed or forced, but must be heated, hammered, and shaped with careful attention. The human soul requires the same patient cultivation. The fires of trial soften our hardness. The hammer blows of difficulty remove our impurities, and the careful shaping of discipline forms us into instruments useful for Allah's purposes. Hamza contributed observations about leadership and community responsibility, drawn from his experience guiding flocks and later guiding pilgrims. His insights addressed how Muslims should navigate the challenges of authority and community involvement. The Good Shepherd knows each sheep individually and leads by example rather than force. Similarly, those who would guide human communities must combine personal righteousness with genuine care for others. Leadership in Islam is not about commanding obedience, but about serving others' spiritual and material well-being. Young Zayd, despite his aged appearance, offered perhaps the most challenging insights about maintaining youthful enthusiasm for faith regardless of external circumstances or chronological age. The heart that truly loves Allah never grows old, he wrote. We have seen empires rise and fall, but the joy of prayer remains fresh each morning. We have witnessed great changes in the world, but the Qur'an speaks to us as powerfully today as it did when we first heard its verses. Age the body as it will, but let the soul remain eternally young in its eagerness to please Allah. The Companion's Testament also included practical guidance about facing specific challenges they had observed in their new Islamic society. The temptations of wealth, the corruptions of political involvement, the spiritual dangers of religious scholarship undertaken for worldly gain, and the subtle pride that could develop in those whose faith had never been severely tested. Their final message emphasized that the same divine mercy that had preserved them in the cave was available to every believer who sincerely sought Allah's protection and guidance. They reminded readers that miracles came in many forms, and that Allah's faithfulness was not dependent on dramatic interventions, but was constant and reliable in all circumstances. As they completed their written legacy, the companions felt a deep sense of peace, knowing they had fulfilled their responsibility to share the wisdom Allah had granted them through their extraordinary experience. As the seasons turned and the companions felt the natural approach of their earthly departure, they experienced a profound calling to return once more to the cave of Hira al-Nur, where their miraculous journey had begun. The pull was not born of nostalgia or sentiment, but of a deep spiritual understanding that their story must complete its circle where it had started. Sheikh Hakim ibn Abdullah, now aged himself, and having become like a father to the 7 men, initially expressed concern about the journey. "My beloved brothers," he said with gentle worry, "the mountain paths are treacherous, and your bodies, though blessed by Allah, now carry the weight of many years. Would it not be better to remain here among those who love and care for you?" But Khalil, speaking for all 7, replied with quiet certainty, "Honored Sheikh, just as a river must return to the sea from which it came, we feel drawn back to the place where Allah first showed us His mercy. We have lived among people and served the community as we were meant to do. But now we sense that our final chapter should be written in solitude with our Creator." The community of Dimishq al-Islamiyya was deeply moved by the companions' decision. Rather than attempting to dissuade them, the believers organized a farewell that honored both their wishes for simplicity and the community's love for them. No grand ceremonies or elaborate gifts were offered, but sincere prayers and heartfelt embraces marked their departure. Abu Bakr ibn Malik, the merchant who had first encountered them upon their awakening, provided simple provisions for their journey. Young students from the mosque's school prepared copies of their testament to be distributed throughout the Islamic world. The families they had helped through their various services gathered to express gratitude and to receive final blessings. The journey up Jabal Qasiyun took 3 days, for the companions no longer possessed the physical vigor of youth, and they paused frequently for rest and prayer. Yet each step seemed to lighten their spirits rather than burden their bodies. The familiar sights and scents of the mountain paths awakened memories, not just of their desperate flight centuries ago, but of the peace they had found in surrendering completely to Allah's will. Hamza, who had guided so many pilgrims through these mountains, now served as guide for his own final pilgrimage. He pointed out landmarks that had remained unchanged through the centuries, reminding his companions of the permanence of Allah's creation, compared to the temporary nature of human civilizations. "See how the rocks remain the same," he observed as they passed a distinctive formation, "while empires have risen and fallen in the valleys below. We worried so much about the persecution of Emperor Cadmus, but where is his empire now? Only Allah and His truth endure forever." When they finally reached the cave of Hira al-Nur, they found it exactly as they had left it centuries ago. The spider's web still guarded the entrance, maintained by countless generations of the small creatures who had inherited the sacred duty from their ancestors. The olive tree had grown even more massive, its ancient trunk bearing witness to the passage of time, while the family of doves that nested in its branches seemed to recognize the returning guardians with welcoming coos. The companions entered their cave with the same reverence they had felt during their first desperate flight, But now that reverence was tempered with deep gratitude and peaceful acceptance, they arranged their simple belongings in the same positions they had occupied during their miraculous sleep, each man naturally returning to his place, as if guided by divine arrangement. In the days that followed, they established a routine of prayer, contemplation, and quiet conversation. They spoke little about worldly matters, focusing instead on preparing their souls for the transition that they all sensed was approaching. Their faithful dog, a descendant of the animal that had guarded them during their 4-century sleep, seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion and maintained a peaceful vigil at the cave entrance. Yusuf spent hours in silent dhikr, his lips moving constantly in remembrance of Allah. His carpenter's hands, now gnarled with age, remained clasped in prayer as he contemplated the perfect craftsmanship of the one who had shaped his life with such precision and care. Salim occupied himself with final revisions to their testament, ensuring that every word conveyed exactly the meaning they intended for future generations. His scholar's mind remained sharp despite his body's weakness, and he took particular care with the theological nuances that would help readers understand the deeper implications of their experience. Omar continued his physician's habit of monitoring his companion's health, but now he focused more on their spiritual well-being than their physical condition. He led them in discussions about preparing for the moment of death and the journey of the soul that awaited them. Marwan used his remaining strength to gather firewood and maintain their simple camp, his blacksmith's appreciation for the properties of different materials now applied to the practical needs of their mountain retreat. Khalil managed their limited provisions with the same careful attention he had once given to his trading business, ensuring that their physical needs were met without excess or waste. Hamza served as their connection to the natural world around them, interpreting the signs of weather and season, and finding in the mountain's rhythms a reflection of the deeper spiritual cycles that governed their lives. Young Zayd, despite his aged appearance, maintained his role as the most enthusiastic in worship, leading them in prayers, with a voice that still carried the clarity and joy of his youth. As they settled into this final phase of their earthly journey, the companions felt a profound completion. They had fled to this cave as desperate refugees. They returned as fulfilled servants who had witnessed the triumph of truth and contributed to its establishment in the world. On the blessed night of the 15th of Ramadan, as the moon hung full and luminous above Jabal Qasiyun, the 7 companions gathered for what they knew would be their final prayer together in this world. The air in the cave of Hir al-Nur seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly presence, and each man felt his heart filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding. They had spent the day in fasting and worship, their bodies weakened by age, but their spirits soaring with anticipation. As the time for Maghrib approached, they performed their ablutions with water from the same spring that had sustained them during their first refuge centuries ago. The simple act of washing their hands and faces became a ritual of purification that seemed to prepare not just their bodies for prayer, but their souls for the journey ahead. Yusuf led the prayer, his voice strong despite his frail appearance. As they prostrated together on the smooth stone floor of the cave, each man felt as if his forehead was touching not just the earth, but the very threshold of paradise. Their recitation of the Qur'an echoed off the cave walls with a resonance that seemed to carry their words beyond the physical realm. After the prayer, they sat in their familiar circle and spoke quietly of their gratitude for the extraordinary life Allah had granted them. Their conversation was marked not by sadness at approaching death, but by wonder at the mercy and wisdom they had witnessed. "My beloved brothers," Yusuf said, his aged hands trembling slightly as he spoke, "when we first entered this cave, we were fleeing from tyranny and seeking Allah's protection. Tonight we enter our final rest, not as refugees, but as servants who have completed their mission." Khalil nodded, his merchant's mind reflecting on the remarkable exchange they had witnessed. "We gave up the temporary comforts of this world, and Allah gave us the eternal treasure of witnessing His truth triumph over falsehood. No transaction in all my years of trading could compare to the profit of this bargain." Salim, ever the scholar, drew parallels between their experience and the stories of the prophets he had studied. Like Prophet Yusuf emerging from the prison to become the advisor to Pharaoh, like Prophet Musa leading his people from slavery to freedom, we have witnessed how Allah transforms apparent defeat into ultimate victory. Omar, with his physician's understanding of life and death, spoke of the transition they were about to face. "Death is not the end of our story, but its beginning. These bodies have served their purpose in this world. Now our souls will return to their true home, where we will meet our teacher Sheikh Nur al-Din and all the righteous who have gone before us." Marwan, thinking of his years at the forge, offered a final metaphor. "We came to this cave as raw iron, full of impurities and weaknesses. The fire of trials has refined us. The hammer of experience has shaped us, and now we are ready to be used in Allah's service in the next world." Hamza, whose shepherd's heart had always been attuned to the rhythms of creation, looked up at the stars visible through the cave opening. "Just as we guided our flocks to safe pastures, Allah has guided us to this peaceful place. The Good Shepherd is calling his servants home." Young Zayd, his voice still carrying the enthusiasm that had marked his character from the beginning, spoke with joy rather than sorrow. "We have lived through the most remarkable story any human could experience. We have seen empires fall and rise. We have witnessed the triumph of Tawheed, and we have served the community of believers. What more could any soul ask for?" As the night deepened, they recited together the verses of the Qur'an they had memorized, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to echo the music of the spheres. They spoke the 99 beautiful names of Allah, savoring each divine attribute they had witnessed, manifested in their lives. They offered prayers of gratitude for their families, their community, Sheikh Hakim, and all those who had shown them kindness. When the time for the pre-dawn prayer arrived, they performed it with a solemnity and joy that marked it as their final act of worship in this world. As they completed their final prostration, each man felt the same divine peace descending upon him that had marked the beginning of their miraculous sleep centuries ago. One by one, they lay down in the same positions they had occupied during their 4-century preservation. Their breathing became slow and peaceful, their faces serene with complete trust in Allah's mercy. The faithful dog that had guarded them settled at the cave entrance, maintaining its eternal vigil. Yusuf was the last to close his eyes, and his final words, spoken in a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, were La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. We bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. As their souls departed their earthly bodies, the cave of Hira al-Nur was filled with a light that had no earthly source. The spider spun new threads across the entrance. The dove settled peacefully in the olive branches, and the mountain itself seemed to exhale in peaceful satisfaction. The 7 companions had completed their extraordinary journey. They had entered the cave as young refugees fleeing persecution, lived through centuries of miraculous preservation, awakened to serve an Islamic community, and finally returned to their Creator as aged servants who had fulfilled their divine purpose. Their bodies remained in the cave, perfectly preserved and peaceful in death, as they had been in their miraculous sleep, while their souls joined the company of the righteous in the presence of Allah. 3 days passed before the people of Dimash al-Islamiyah realized that something remarkable had occurred in the cave of Hira al-Nur. The first sign came when shepherds in the valleys below reported seeing an unusual light emanating from the mountain peak during the nights following the companions' departure. The light was not harsh or blinding, but gentle and peaceful, like the glow of 1,000 oil lamps shining through silk. Sheikh Hakim ibn Abdullah had been troubled by dreams for 3 consecutive nights. In each dream, he saw the 7 companions standing in a garden of indescribable beauty, their faces radiant with joy, gesturing for him to come and see what Allah had prepared for his faithful servants. On the morning of the 4th day, he could no longer ignore the calling in his heart. Gathering a small group of the mosque's most trusted members, including Abu Bakr ibn Malik and several of the younger scholars who had studied with the companions, Sheikh Hakim set out for the mountain. The journey that had taken the aged companions 3 days was completed by the younger men in 1, their hearts filled with both anticipation and reverence. As they approached the cave of Hira al-Nur, they found the familiar signs of divine protection that had guarded the companions throughout their miraculous lives. The spider's web stretched across the entrance, more intricate and beautiful than ever before, glistening with dewdrops that seemed to capture and reflect light like tiny prisms. The family of doves cooed softly from the olive tree, their song carrying an otherworldly melody that brought tears to the visitor's eyes. Sheikh Hakim approached the cave entrance with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching the Kaaba. As he gently parted the spider's web, a fragrance unlike anything in this world wafted from within us, not the scent of flowers or perfumes, but something that seemed to carry the essence of paradise itself. Inside the cave, they found the 7 companions exactly as they had arranged themselves for their final rest. Their bodies lay in peaceful repose, their faces serene and smiling, as if they had fallen asleep while contemplating the most beautiful sight imaginable. Their clothes remained clean and fresh, their beards neatly arranged, their hands positioned in the same humble manner they had maintained during their earthly prayers. But what struck the visitors most profoundly was the sense of presence that filled the cave. Though the companions' souls had clearly departed for their eternal reward, the space itself seemed blessed with a peace that transcended human understanding. Each man who entered felt his own heart filled with tranquility, and his faith strengthened by witnessing this final sign of Allah's mercy. Abu Bakr ibn Malik, the merchant who had first encountered the awakened companions, knelt beside their resting forms and wept tears of both sorrow and joy. "They have returned to their Lord as they lived among us," he whispered, with dignity, humility, and complete trust in Allah's wisdom. The young scholars who had studied under the companions found their own understanding of death transformed by what they witnessed. This was not the frightening dissolution they had imagined, but a peaceful transition that seemed as natural as the setting of the sun or the changing of the seasons. Sheikh Hakim spent several hours in the cave, praying and contemplating the remarkable story that had reached its completion in this sacred space. As he prepared to leave, he made a decision that would preserve the companions' legacy for generations to come. "This cave will remain as Allah has prepared it," he announced to his companions. "We will not disturb their rest, nor will we permit others to treat this place as a site for superstitious veneration. Instead, it will serve as a reminder of Allah's faithfulness to those who trust in Him, and a place where believers can come to reflect on the temporary nature of this world and the eternal nature of divine mercy." Word of the companions' peaceful passing spread throughout the Islamic world with the same swiftness that had marked the news of their awakening. But rather than creating grief, the reports brought comfort and inspiration to believers everywhere. The story of the 7 young men who had chosen faith over comfort, been preserved through centuries by divine mercy, served their community with humility, and finally returned to their Creator in perfect peace, became a source of strength for all who faced trials of faith. Scholars began arriving from distant cities to study the companions' testament and to record the details of their remarkable story. The document they had prepared became one of the most copied and studied texts in Islamic literature, translated into every language spoken by Muslims and memorized by countless students. The cave of Hira al-Nur became a place of quiet pilgrimage, not for those seeking miracles or supernatural interventions, but for believers who wished to strengthen their own faith through contemplating the example of perfect trust in Allah. Visitors would climb the mountain paths in small groups, spend time in silent reflection near the cave, and return to their communities with renewed commitment to living their own lives according to Islamic principles. The spider continued its ancient duty, maintaining the web that had protected the companions throughout their miraculous journey. The doves raised their young in the olive tree, their songs carrying the peace of the sacred space to travelers throughout the valleys, and the mountain itself became a symbol of the permanence of divine truth in a world of constant change. The 7 companions had achieved what every believer hopes for. They had lived according to their faith, served their community, and returned to Allah with their beliefs intact and their mission fulfilled. In the years that followed the companions' peaceful return to Allah, their story became woven into the very fabric of Islamic civilization. What had begun as the desperate flight of 7 young believers from persecution had transformed into one of the most beloved and instructive narratives in Islamic literature, told in mosques from Al-Andalus to the borders of China, recounted by mothers to their children, and studied by scholars seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of divine providence. The testament they had written during their final years became a cornerstone of Islamic spiritual literature. Copies were housed in the great libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, while countless handwritten versions circulated among common believers who found in the companions simple wisdom guidance for their own daily struggles. The document's power lay not in complex theological arguments, but in its clear demonstration of how extraordinary faith could be lived through ordinary circumstances. Sheikh Hakim bin Abdullah, now recognized as the foremost authority on the companion's story, spent his remaining years ensuring that their message was preserved accurately for future generations. He established a school of Islamic studies adjacent to the mosque in Dimashq al-Islamiyah, where students from across the known world came to study not just the companion's story, but the principles of faith and perseverance it exemplified. The school's curriculum included practical instruction in various trades and crafts, following the companion's example of combining spiritual devotion with useful work. Students learned carpentry from masters who had been trained by Yusuf's methods, studied ethical commerce according to principles Khalil had demonstrated, and practiced medicine with the holistic approach Omar had taught. The school produced generations of Muslim professionals who carried the companion's example of integrating faith with worldly responsibilities into every corner of the Islamic world. As decades passed, the story began to take on additional dimensions that reflected the universal nature of its message. In times of persecution, Muslim communities would draw strength from remembering how Allah had protected the 7 young believers. During periods of prosperity and ease, the companion's humility in the face of fame served as a reminder that worldly success could be as dangerous to faith as worldly persecution. The cave itself remained unchanged, protected by the same miraculous signs that had guarded it throughout the companions' lives. Pilgrims who climbed Jabal Qasiyun reported that the journey itself became a form of spiritual purification, with each step up the mountain path serving as an opportunity for reflection and prayer. The physical challenge of the ascent reminded visitors of the effort required to maintain faith in difficult circumstances, while the peace that descended upon them as they approached the cave offered a foretaste of the tranquility that awaits those who persevere. Religious authorities established guidelines for visiting the cave that reflected the companion's own approach to spiritual matters. Visitors were encouraged to come seeking spiritual inspiration rather than material miracles, to focus on the lessons of the story rather than its supernatural aspects, and to leave transformed, not by magical experiences, but by deeper understanding of their relationship with Allah. The annual pilgrimage to the cave became a significant event in the Islamic calendar of the region. Each year on the 15th of Ramadan, the anniversary of the companion's final return to Allah, thousands of believers would make the journey up the mountain. But rather than a carnival atmosphere, these gatherings maintained the dignity and reverence that the companions themselves would have appreciated. The influence of their story extended far beyond the Islamic world. Christian and Jewish communities in the region, recognizing the universal themes of faith and divine providence in the narrative, began to incorporate elements of the companion's example into their own spiritual teachings. The story became a bridge between different religious communities, demonstrating that the fundamental human struggle between material comfort and spiritual integrity transcended particular religious boundaries. Scholars of comparative religion noted the parallels between the companion's story and similar narratives in other traditions. while Islamic theologians emphasized the unique aspects that reflected specifically Quranic teachings about divine mercy and the nature of true worship. The story served both as a point of interfaith dialogue and as a distinctly Islamic contribution to humanity's shared spiritual heritage. Perhaps most significantly, the companion's legacy influenced how Muslims understood the relationship between individual faith and social responsibility. Their example demonstrated that true spirituality could not be separated from service to the community, that personal salvation was intertwined with social justice, and that the highest expression of faith was not withdrawal from the world, but engagement with it according to divine principles. As the Islamic Empire expanded and evolved, facing new challenges and opportunities that the companions could never have imagined, their story continued to provide relevant guidance. Muslim scientists working in the great translation centers found inspiration in Salam's dedication to preserving and transmitting knowledge. Islamic merchants establishing trade routes across Africa and Asia remembered Khalil's principles of honest commerce. Military leaders protecting Muslim lands drew strength from recalling how the companions had chosen principle over safety. The story's enduring power lay in its demonstration that every age presents the same fundamental choice the 7 young men had faced in their cave, whether to trust in Allah's wisdom and mercy, or to seek security in the temporary comforts and approval of the world. Each generation of believers found in their example both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that Allah's protection is real and reliable, and challenge to live their own lives with the same courage and integrity the companions had demonstrated. In the end, the 7 companions had achieved a form of immortality that transcended their miraculous preservation in the cave. Their story lived on in the hearts and minds of believers. Their example continued to guide and inspire, and their message of unwavering trust in Allah echoed through the centuries as a testament to the eternal truth that faith, properly understood and faithfully practiced, transforms both individuals and civilizations. As centuries continued to flow like rivers toward the sea, the story of the 7 companions of the cave of Hira al-Nur became more than historical narrative. It transformed into a living testament that spoke to each generation in the language they needed to hear. In times of darkness, it whispered of Allah's protection. In times of prosperity, it reminded believers of what truly mattered. In moments of doubt, it proclaimed the certainty of divine justice and mercy. The mountain cave remained as Allah had appointed it, a place where the temporal and eternal touched. The spider's descendants continued their ancestral duty, weaving protective barriers that seemed to exist outside the normal patterns of nature. The olive tree grew ever more magnificent, its roots reaching deep into the mountain's heart, while its branches stretched toward heaven, embodying the perfect balance the companions had achieved between earthly responsibility and celestial aspiration. Pilgrims from distant lands continued to make the arduous journey up Jabal Qasiyun, but they came not seeking magical cures or supernatural interventions. Instead, they sought what the companions themselves had found in that sacred space: the peace that comes from complete surrender to Allah's will, the strength that flows from unwavering trust in divine wisdom, and the joy that fills hearts aligned with eternal truth. Among these pilgrims was a young woman named Fatima bint Ahmad, a scholar from the universities of Al-Andalus, who had traveled across the Mediterranean to study the Companion's Testament firsthand. As she sat in meditation near the cave entrance, copying passages from their writings into her own journal, she reflected on how their message spoke to her own century's challenges. They faced the choice between faith and social acceptance, she wrote in her notes, while we face the choice between spiritual depth and intellectual pride. They were tested by persecution, while we are tested by comfort. Yet the fundamental question remains the same. Will we trust in Allah completely, or will we hedge our faith with worldly securities? Her observations captured a truth that scholars across the centuries had noted. The Companion's story possessed a timeless relevance that transcended the specific circumstances of their original trial. Each age found in their example guidance for its own particular temptations and challenges. In the great libraries of Baghdad and Cairo, their testament was studied alongside the works of the greatest Islamic scholars. But unlike purely academic texts, their writings retained the power to transform readers' hearts as well as their minds. Students would begin reading their simple prose, seeking historical information, and finish with tears of recognition, seeing their own spiritual struggles reflected in the Companion's humble wisdom. The influence of their story extended into the most unexpected corners of Islamic civilization. Artists incorporated symbols from their narrative into the geometric patterns that adorned mosque walls. Poets found in their example metaphors for the soul's journey from ignorance to enlightenment. Musicians composed melodies that captured the peace of their cave refuge and the joy of their awakening to a transformed world. Even the practical arts bore their influence. Architects designing new mosques would sometimes include small chambers for retreat and contemplation, inspired by the cave of Hira al-Nur. Merchants established charitable foundations, following Khalil's example of using worldly success to serve Allah's creation. Physicians integrated the Companion's understanding of spiritual and physical health into their practice of medicine. But perhaps the most profound impact of their legacy was on the countless individual believers who found in their story the courage to face their own moments of trial. The merchant tempted to cheat his customers would remember Khalil's honesty. The scholar facing pressure to compromise his principles would recall Salim's dedication to truth. The craftsman struggling with perfectionism would find peace in Yusuf's understanding that excellence comes from consciousness of Allah, not from worldly acclaim. As the Islamic world faced new challenges, the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, the gradual decline of political power, and the eventual rise of European colonialism, each generation found in the Companion's example resources for maintaining faith and dignity in difficult circumstances. Their story became a repository of spiritual strength that sustained Muslim communities through centuries of both triumph and trial. The cave itself became a symbol recognized throughout the Islamic world, representing not escape from responsibility, but refuge for spiritual renewal. Countless believers who never made the physical journey to Jabal Qasiyun carried the image of that sacred space in their hearts, finding in its peace a sanctuary they could access through prayer and contemplation wherever they might be. In the end, the 7 companions had achieved something far greater than their own salvation. Remarkable though that was, they had become eternal teachers, their lives serving as a curriculum in faith that would instruct believers until the end of time. Their story demonstrated that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary choices, could rise to extraordinary heights of faith and service when they placed their complete trust in Allah's wisdom and mercy. The spider continued its weaving, the doves sang their peaceful songs, and the mountain stood as eternal witness to the truth that those who choose Allah above all else will find that He has chosen them for blessings beyond their imagination. In the cave of Hira al-Nur, time had stopped to allow eternity to shine through, and that light continued to illuminate the path for all who sought to walk in the footsteps of the faithful. Their story lived on, as fresh and relevant as the morning prayer, as enduring as the mountains, and as certain as the promise that Allah never abandons those who trust in Him completely. Thank you for spending this time in reflection. If you found peace in today's SEP's recitation, kindly subscribe so you can join us again for the next chapter of the Qur'an, Insha Allah.